Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us for another segment of Health Professional Radio. In this segment, we're going to be speaking with Mr. James Geraghty. He's joining us here to talk about rare diseases and to talk about his book, Inside the Orphan Drug Revolution, The Promise of Patient-Centered Biotechnology. Welcome to Health Professional Radio. James Geraghty, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, give us a brief look into a bit of your professional background and then talk about what prompted you to write Inside the Orphan Drug Revolution.
Well, thank you. What prompted me to write it is indeed my background, because I spent 40 years working in the Orphan Drug Revolution, as I described in the book, starting back in 1981, which was just as the Orphan Drug Act was being passed in Congress, which ultimately approved in 1983, and which is really one of the triggers of the Orphan Drug Revolution. I had the privilege of working in hemophilia therapies back in 1981, and over the last 40 years, I've worked at various companies, most notably Genzyme for over 20 years, which was really a pioneer in the rare disease orphan drug world. And today I serve as a director of several independent biotechnology companies looking to develop other rare disease therapies.
First question, what makes a disease a rare disease, and what exactly are orphan drugs?
Well, orphan drugs are drugs for orphan diseases, and orphan diseases are, commonly described as rare diseases. They're officially defined in the Orphan Drug Act in the United States as diseases that afflict fewer than 200,000 people, which is less than 0.5% of the population.
Now, you talked about the passage of the United States Orphan Drug Act back in 1983. Did that do the trick as far as addressing these rare diseases and the drugs that are needed for them, or is there still a bit more legislation that's needed?
Well, that had a big impact. It was kind of the starting gun, you might say, on the revolution. And since then, before that act was passed, very few, in the years before that act was passed, fewer than 10 orphan therapies have been approved. In the years since, more than 1,000 have. And so it had a big impact. But there are more than 7,000 rare genetic diseases. Your listeners will know some of the more common ones like hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, sickle cell anemia, and so on. Mm-hmm. But the 7,000 others are very rare, and today there are therapies available for only a small percentage of them. So we have a lot more to do to bring therapies to collectively the millions of people around the United States and the world who still suffer from those diseases.
Talk a bit about the trend in the 80s of genetic engineering approach instead of conventional approaches to pharmaceutical development, if you would, briefly.
Yeah, biotechnology was one of the other, real triggers to the revolution. These are very complex diseases, and the traditional medicinal chemistry of the pharmaceutical industry can't really treat them effectively. It was only when we learned when we came to understand DNA and learned how to engineer DNA through, genetic engineering, that we were able to make the kinds of proteins and gene therapies that are actually needed to improve these conditions. And so most of the therapies, almost all of the therapies that have been brought forward for these diseases have employed some of the tools of biotechnology.
Now, there was a particular rare genetic disorder that basically transformed the industry.
Yeah, it's actually pronounced Gaucher disease. A French physician discovered it in the 1800s, 19th century. But it wasn't until the 1960s that a pioneering physician at the U.S. NIH named Dr. Roscoe Brady, who dedicated his entire career to understanding diseases like that, understood what the defect was, understood that it was an enzyme that was defective that needed to be replaced, figured out a very complex way to source the enzyme, which is very difficult to do, figured out the dosing. And as I describe in the book, and one of the many miracles in this history, Dr. Brady conducted a clinical trial with 7 patients, and the drug didn't work in 6 of them. And it only worked in 1 because he was only a 3-year-old child who shouldn't have been enrolled in the trial, but was enrolled because of his mother's insistence. And the success in that patient led to the company Genzyme taking on that therapy. That drug became called Ceridase and Cerezyme, and its success around the world in providing access to patients and securing reimbursement is really what triggered the flowering of orphan drug therapies throughout the biopharmaceutical industry.
Now, you mentioned earlier in our conversation that a rare disease was defined by one that affected a very small amount of people worldwide. For those of us who don't have one of these diseases and we don't have a family member with one of these rare diseases, explain to us why it's important for us to be interested in this particular issue?
That's a very good question, Neil, and that goes to the heart really of why I wrote the book. Because as you kind of suggest, many people think that, genetic diseases, quote, run in families. And if you have no family history of one, you don't need to worry about it. But as I'm sure you know, that's not true. There are some diseases that do run in families, but there are many genetic diseases that can strike at any birth, any child, any grandchild, any niece or nephew. And so the question that, people have to ask themselves is, if that were to strike their family, which it could by, as they say, an unlucky roll of the genetic dice at any birth, would we want to have therapies available to treat it? And if we do, people need to understand that we can't take this revolution for granted, and people need to continue to advocate for the therapies and the reimbursement that are needed to provide access.
Now, it's my understanding that rare disease drug development is quite expensive due to the fact that it's a rare disease. How can we make these drugs affordable? How can we make the research affordable?
Well, also an important question. I addressed that in the last section of the book in depth. And, the answer, there are a couple of answers. The first is that because these first of all, these approved FDA therapies are all covered by insurance. And 95% of Americans have access to insurance, and the 5% who don't can get coverage under patient assistance programs. And so the question for most patients, individuals, is not quite the list price of the drug. It's the cost, the out-of-pocket costs, co-pays and deductibles that their insurance policies impose. At a system level, what people need to understand is that 90% of all prescriptions in America today are generic. And as these very large drugs for very large populations go off patent and become generic, the savings from those generic drugs is what allows us to fund and afford the development of innovative new therapies.
It's also important to note that the Orphan Drug Revolution, as it relates to rare diseases, has taught us a bit about how to treat some of the more prevalent diseases as well, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, just to name a couple.
That's exactly right. Increasingly, as with cancer, years ago we used to think cancer was one disease. Now we understand that it's a collection of thousands of individual, very specific subtypes. The same thing is true for more common diseases. Alzheimer's is a great example. Many people have heard of, sadly, of people who suffer from what's called early onset Alzheimer's. That's really a result of a genetic defect of a subtype of Alzheimer's, and understanding those genetic subtypes and how to treat them is opening the door to ways to treat the much broader populations as well.
What do you see as the future of rare disease drug development, and what about the promise of the newest technologies?
Yeah, the field is at a crossroads. I mean, the technology potential has never been greater. Genetic therapies are the wave of the future. Genetic therapies enable the promise of one-time treatment for a lifetime of benefit, and there are many of those in development. But right now, as we speak, there's a chill over the field in terms of investment because of a variety of factors, including calls for drug price controls on Capitol Hill and unfortunate delays and burdensome requirements for FDA approval that are excessive for some of these diseases. Investment has dried up, and today, if you look at the headlines in this field, what you're reading about are companies going out of business, programs being terminated, and patients being denied access. And so what we really need are for people to understand the importance of continuing to advocate, as people did 40 years ago, for the passage of the Orphan Drug Act, to be able to sustain the innovation we need going forward.
Give us a website where our listeners can learn much more and get a copy of your book as well.
Well, thank you for asking. The name of the book, as you said, is Inside the Orphan Drug Revolution. And the simple website people can use is just orphandrugrevolution.com.
James, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much. I'm hoping that your book has continued success. And I'm looking forward to another conversation with you if you'll return.
Thank you, Neil. I look forward to that as well.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with James Geraghty. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at Anchor, Spotify, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.